much. Okay, we're going to item 15, and this is on page 335. This is the congestion question. This is the main findings report, as it's referred to, which was released on Monday. You will notice that it was dated July. Members, we have been wanting to get this up for a while, but look, when elections get in the way, some things just don't see daylight. It is now, though, and it's before us. So we've got a report. This was a project of work that was formerly called, gosh, we really create mouthfuls, don't we? The Auckland Smarter Transport Pricing Project. I think that's what it was. Now, it's probably a long time since we became familiar with this. We had end of 17, I think, we had a report. It became the congestion question. That first report had a lot of baseline data, summarised a lot of research. So the research hasn't just started, it had started in the previous report. And it also looked at a lot of international schemes, particularly, I think from memory at that time, Stockholm, London, Singapore, and now there's more recent schemes like Gothenburg, again in Sweden. So this second phase we're seeing today is the main findings report, and it's an even more detailed investigation. And it's the technical report it's attached to the agenda. It was mailed out on Monday, and it's supported by a 140-page technical report. So it's quite dense in what has gone into what we're reading in our summary report on our agenda today. So, welcoming the team that have been working on this for quite a long time. Now, David Hawkey, we all know, who heads up our growth, transport and infrastructure strategy group. He's with us. David, I'm going to allow you to introduce your team. I know Azim has been authoring this report, but David, you've been at the coalface of this for some months.
Well, thank you. So, yeah, I'm privileged to have me today. We've got Jared Darlington, he is the PwC Director and the Project Director for the Congestion Question Project. I've got Brian Mickey, who is an advisor in transport and travel demand management and pricing at Auckland Transport. And I'll call to have a few words in a moment. Shane Ellis will pop up and say a few words as well. So, look, I propose just to go through a brief presentation to explain the main findings of this phase of work to you. Then I'll have Shane come up and give a bit of a personal view, an AT view on this work, and then we'll open it to questions and the rest. So I'll hold. Okay. Does this? What do I point it at?
Another button. Pointed at Duncan, it always works.
Maybe Duncan, do you want to try to drive it from there? Yeah, sorry. It does not seem to be. It is a bit longer than just one slide, so
we're saving on batteries. It's part of our 10-year budget.
That was gone past. Okay, so I suppose to give some background to this. So one of the reasons that we're here today is that when we started this work back in 2017, the Planning Committee made a resolution that we needed to report key findings or key milestones to this committee during this project. So with the release of the technical papers on Monday, this is a key milestone, so this is one of the reasons we're here today, and we also will be asking for approval to do further work on this project with the partners. Now, if we think about the congestion question and what it's trying to do and why it started, it's really important to think of this as an ongoing journey of I suppose, evidence that shows that primarily if you want to address congestion and improve congestion, you can't really build your way out of congestion. So this was a big finding of the initial 215 ATAP work, where even with significant investments into the Auckland region and significant investments into mode shift, congestion remained a problem. So from that, there was a recommendation that work goes on with a purpose to support a decision on whether or not to introduce congestion pricing in Auckland. That could be some of the network or all of the network. So phase one started in around 2015. The work was completed in 2017 of the first phase, in which the chair mentioned, where we released publicly released a report that really went through and gave better understanding of the economic foundations of congestion charging, what it was and how it worked, why congestion was an issue and challenge for Auckland, and it confirmed it was an issue challenge for Auckland. And it also had a look at the schemes applied overseas and some of the learnings. And there has been a number of schemes applied overseas now, and they have been successful. So it was a lot of learnings from that. We came back in December 2017, and we reported to this committee on the findings of that work. And this committee gave the approval for us to go to the second phase of this work, which we'll talk about the findings of today, which we were asked to take option evaluation of potential options for congestion charging, but also look at wider options to improve network performance in Auckland, with the ideal scenario of coming back with a preferred scheme. And we also were asked to examine a range of issues, including particularly social impact, environmental and technical and administration issues of how a scheme would work. So that work has finished, and I suppose I'll be reporting today on what we've found. Look, the main findings from this work, and I think this is a really important finding here, is that technically there is a strong case for implementing congestion charging in Auckland. And I think what we need to be really clear in our minds about what we've found through this work is that congestion is a problem for Auckland. It has a lot of disbenefits that affect Auckland, including our economy, the access to jobs, and things like that. And this work has said that if you really want to address congestion, you really do have to think about things that affect the demand for your network, and congestion pricing or congestion charging is a very effective tool in dealing with a congestion problem. So that is the big finding. And I suppose if you extrapolate that finding, if you want to really change the congestion outcomes in Auckland and improve the network performance, if you don't do pricing and demand management, you won't change those outcomes. It's very hard. So this is a really important thing for us to think about here, because literally if we want to change these outcomes, this is a really strong tool. When we looked at the options and we modelled them in quite considerable detail, there was many important benefits for Auckland that could be attained if you applied one of these schemes. There was significant improvements in network performance. A regional-wide scheme could get improvements of 8 to 12% across the network. And putting that in sort of non-technical terms, this means that you'd have the performance that you see in the school holidays all the time. That seems quite hard for us to fathom when you drive around Auckland at the moment. But if you look at the results in the case from Stockholm with applied congestion charging, it's quite fascinating. I spent a bit of time preparing for this, looking at YouTube videos of what people thought of Stockholm and what had happened there. And it is just quite amazing, really. They had a 20% decrease in trips across that network. And people have now got a 70% approval of congestion charging in Stockholm because people have seen what it can do. It's quite a different way of doing things, I suppose. You get both improved speed and more reliable journey time. Now, the reliable journey time is a really important thing to think about, because as we know, if you're travelling on different days and you don't really know what those conditions will be out there on that day, some days it's really great and you get there in 15 minutes, sometimes take an hour. You will build in buffer time if you need to be somewhere at the right time, so these trips take a lot longer. Congestion charging is far cheaper than bringing in more road capacity. I think at the last planning committee, I came presenting on the additional Waitemata Harbour Crossing Connections business case. And you sort of could see from that business case, when we were looking forward, the serious cost of bringing roading capacity into the Auckland network. If I recall, the roading component of that business case was up to $10 million if we were going to put a new crossing in. What was really interesting in that business case, and it's the first business case of size that's done this, road pricing, congestion charging type mechanisms were put a part of the business case. A key finding of that business case is that by applying road pricing, you could put off or delay the need for that roading capacity by up to 10 years. So that's a huge saving for Auckland if we can do more of demand management up front. It supports improvement in local air quality, which in schemes overseas like London, this has been a significant thing that's been improvement. And when I was in London 3 years ago, walking in the congestion area there, I couldn't believe the air quality versus I've been there 17 years ago. And it makes a contribution, modest but important, to greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously important for this council in terms of what we've declared as important climate change targets. And most important, I think, for this to recognise that there are some social impacts, but I can honestly say, in any business case I've been involved in, this has been where social impacts and thinking about them have been more upfront than any I've seen. I think the social impact work we've done so far is the most comprehensive I've seen in a business case. So I think all the partners and the staff have thought about social impacts on potential volume is quite upfront and a big part of the thinking. And I suppose the recommendations of these reports is that while there are impacts and they will have effect on people, there are ways we can manage those. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about more today. A big part of this work, and we're asked to do, was to have a look at a whole range of potential schemes, not just pricing type or charging type schemes, and have a look what was a potential best fit scheme for Auckland. So we looked at 26 options, and as I say, there was a range of options, including things like PT fares, parking, reverse tolling, as in effect you pay people not to come to the network, so we were very broad-minded in the way we looked at these schemes. Some of these schemes weren't really able to stand on their own feet, but potentially could be part of a wider transport demand management sort of package. So from that work where we analysed a range of factors, with the strongest weighting being around network performance, but social, environmental, economic safety and ability to apply a scheme practically and flexibly were thought about, 5 options fell out. And what's really interesting about these options, that 4 of them, the top 4, currently are applied around the world. So in a way, it was quite a good menu. There was a city centre Cordon, which we'll talk a bit about more in a moment, where in effect you are charged to enter and exit an area at a time of day. And this has present in Stockholm at the moment. An isthmus area charge, where you have an area where you'll be charged to enter or exit that area, but also be charged within the area, that has present in London. Strategic corridors, where based on a roading hierarchy that would be identified, you are charged to travel down congested corridors at some time of the day. This has present in Singapore. A combination of the first one and the third one, when you maybe start with a corridor and then look at strategic corridors, this has present in Gothenburg. And then the last one was, I suppose, the most close to what you'd see in an economic textbook, where in effect all roads across the region that were congested would have congestion charging based on more sophisticated GPS type technology. No country currently does this type of scheme, where Singapore is starting to think about and look at this scheme. So these were very thoroughly assessed, and we spent, fair to say, a lot of time. And there is currently 20 technical papers on the MOT site, which goes into all factors of these things. So from that, 2 potential options were shortlisted as having potential for Auckland. The first was the city Cordon, and the other one was strategic corridors. I'll quickly run you through just why they came through. You see the city centre Cordon there. This is an illustrative scheme there, where you see literally State Highway 1 and State Highway 16 in red there almost act like a bit of a fence, really. So when you cross those fences and go into the city, you'll pay a charge for going in for entry and exit in the AM and PM peak. So this came through as a potential good option for Auckland, because it has it's quite a small area, so in effect it's a small impact on network performance, but this means it's a potentially a good sort of starting thing. This one would mainly target the commuting trips that come into the Auckland Central City, because you've got 15% of the employment there. The technology is currently available to do this, and will be done using what they call automatic number plate recognition technology, and that's well used already, and you could repurpose some of the infrastructure to do this. It would generate low revenue due to the trip size or the capture, but again, because it's actually low cost, it generates a positive benefit cost ratio. Interestingly enough, all the options set for that regional GPS-based one have positive BCRs, which in transport world is pretty good. The equity impacts are likely to be modest because there's high provision of PT into this area, and there's also a low number of trips being captured. It presents a low, I suppose what really made us think about this is it presents a potential low-risk option to start this type of scheme. Now, some stakeholders have said to me, oh, you know, you've got COVID-19 and the central city is struggling at the moment. I think it's really important to think, and the report does talk about when you could implement such a scheme. A scheme like this, you would not do it before 2025. You'd need to bring on the Central Rail Link sort of PT extra capacity first. So this is still in the future. So even with, hoping with the COVID impacts we've seen, hopefully we would see some improvements and changes by that time. The next one was the strategic corridor scheme. So this is where I said before you have a roading hierarchy, basically state highways or main arteries which are congested, and you'd pay a charge to travel on those in some part of the day. This actually generates quite meaningful performance benefits, and we've seen, if you look at the numbers, this is through this sort of scheme it was fully implemented, you'd get the school holiday effect if it was in place. It's low technical implementation and operating risk because we could repurpose quite a bit of the currently available technology, which is around the automatic number plate recognition technology. It has a potential to generate net revenue of over 200 million a year. Modelling around I want to talk about a tariff scheme a bit, potential tariff scheme a bit later, was around 250. When you start thinking that to run a scheme is, illustratively around 80 to 100 million, you're generating similar revenues that you currently get from your regional fuel tax, around 150 million a year. So it has a significant ability to self-fund itself, and then you can think about what you do with these revenues. The financial cost charges on households spatially is reasonably equal because it's come across the region. But as we'll talk about later, obviously if you're a low-income road user who can't change the time, there would be impacts on that person, and we'll talk about the mitigations of that. So there was further analysis on those two schemes were done, but both schemes were considered feasible technically and could be implemented. But I suppose when we think about what this project was asked to do, which is the biggest weight was on improvements to network performance, the spatial scale of these schemes, and the impact that the strategic corridors have made it as a preferred scheme. Now, the other real great benefit of a strategic corridor scheme is that you could phase the implementation around where you have the strongest PT alternatives, and as you build those PT alternatives up, you could roll out the scheme. So the report spends some detail talking about how you could start with a central city scheme, and then you would increase the scheme down congested corridors as you do PT enhancements. And there is the indicative, I suppose, pathway for how that could work. But I suppose it's still worth recognising that the central city corridor could be a potential first step, but in some ways the strategic corridor, if you started in the centre, and the Cordon are very similar in effect, really. One of the real advancements, I think, of this phase of the work, and this was a lot of time was spent on this, was to develop an indicative or illustrative tariff structure. So this was about how would you actually charge people, and what sort of charges would they face, and when would they face these charges, and what would the sort of impact be on them. So this is quite key, because what you achieve through congestion pricing is all related to the price. And it's really important to recognise here that these schemes aren't revenue-raising schemes. What we're trying to do is find the minimum charge that will enable a person to change their behaviour, or at least consider changing their behaviour. This is not about putting a financial burden on people that cannot change their behaviour. That is not what this is about. This is really about getting people to think before they make that trip, do I really need to make this trip now, or could I change it? So there is quite a bit of detail in the report about what this could look like. There is a 2-hour journey window for AM and PM peak is proposed. Then you have a sort of a scheduled 30-minute time bands within this window, with the highest charge at the peak being $3.50 going down to a $1.50 charge. Now, the reason that the $3.50 was proposed as a potential fare is it is lines with what you'd get in a 2-zone public transport fare. You wouldn't want the peak fare to be cheaper than catching public transport, because why would you? And then there's also no charge for interpeak, off-peak periods, and the charges apply for Monday and Friday. Now, what's really important from this illustrated tariff structure is by applying the structure and modelling it, you get these results that we've talked about before. And also, quite importantly, we talk about mitigations. Built into this tariff structure is for individual motorists, no motorist would pay more than $7 a day. It would be capped at that price, because why we thought of that is, A, we don't want to have too much of a burden on the motorist, and if people can't change behaviour, we don't want to take extra charges on them. So if you can't change behaviour, there is a capped cost. Social assessment was front in mind of all this work, and as I said before, there's been a substantial amount of work done on social and impact assessment sort of thing. And as to be expected, some households are disproportionately affected, and some low incomes would pay more proportionally than high incomes in terms of their income. It was really interesting as a part of it, and people are very interested to see some of the individual stories around vulnerable users. We did quite a bit of work where we interviewed 50 vulnerable users, which by vulnerable users I mean people that are of low income, can't change that time and would face the charge, and what it would mean for them and their families, and there's quite a lot of detail about that. And so we've talked to people on the ground about what this would mean, and this sample was primarily aimed at low-income road users. Mana whenua, and there was some work done on that, would be impact on the access and engagement to places of identity, and there is a technical report looking at what it means for mana whenua in terms of would it for places that have special meaning for them, what would this congestion charge mean for them? And it would have impacts. So if we went to a third phase, we'd need to think about that in more detail. The reports go into some detail about potential measures, but recognises that we do need to do more work if we went to phase 3 on social impacts. There's a talk of a daily charging cap, which I talked before. There's talk about discounts and credits. There's also using of ways to identify people that could be vulnerable, for example, the community service card. There'll be more work required on phase 3 about people who are low-income working type road users sort of thing. They have to do more how we would identify and use them. Mitigations could be applied for disability and mobility users, and there are some suggestions of how such a scheme could work. But I think there's been a lot of work done, but before any final decision would be made, there'll be more work to really get the grips to some of those areas that it was just a bit hard to identify in this part of the project. In terms of revenue and technology, as I mentioned before, a full scheme could generate over more than 200 million, and then per annum. And now thinking about how you'd use this to pay for, well, in the first instance, the report is recommended that we use to wash, I suppose, the face of the scheme with the operating costs. But then you could consider, and this would be a part of a future decision, whether you'd use it for mitigation measures for vulnerable users and support public transport infrastructure and services. And in time, it could be replace or reduce your regional fuel tax. The technology is available at the time, and there's no technological hindrance to do these schemes. I suppose I'll just wrap up quickly because I know we haven't got much time. And I suppose what we're asking for in terms of a recommendation for this item, first, we've asked you to receive the findings of this phase of work as we are under delegation from this committee. We are recommending that we continue to work with government on this process and to undertake scoping work of the next phase, and we'll bring that back to you for decision to go forward. So that's it, but I think I'll just quickly call up Shane. Oh, there, Shane. Would you like to say a few words there, Shane?
So welcome Shane, Chief Executive of Auckland Transport, also Wayne Donnelly, the Deputy Chair of the Board, and the Auckland Transport Board considered this paper, or its variation of this paper, at its Tuesday meeting. So I'm not sure who wants to open up here. Wayne, would you like to commence?
The Chief Executive is delegated to me, Mr. Chairman.
Good.
It's not, on the way in, coming down the North Shore busway, flying into Auckland, not congested at all. This morning I thought back to 1996 when I was Director of Planning of the then Auckland City Council, and my team pulled together a significant piece of work on congestion pricing in Auckland. It was interesting to reflect that the reasons for doing it were the same then as they are now, and I thought that was an excellent presentation you got today. There were things missing though at that time. One was overseas examples that you could relate to Auckland, that you could draw on. The other one was the range of technological capabilities you could have to practically implement it at reasonable cost, etc. And the other was the offering of alternative modes in Auckland. We're miles ahead of where we were back at that time. And yes, the Auckland Transport Board did consider this on Tuesday, and it endorsed the findings of the report. It authorised the Chief Executive to continue to apply resources to the development of the way forward, and also made it clear that we, as a board, very much expected Auckland Transport to play a central role in this, both in terms of its development and its eventual implementation. We see this, the congestion question report, as really the initial strategic business case, and from here there's quite a lot of development work to do to develop the detail. If I could summarise Auckland Transport Board's view, we see congestion pricing as an essential capability going forward that increases the efficiency of congested corridors for those people who have to use those corridors at congested times. That's the fundamental reason for this. It increases the efficiency of it. Now, that efficiency comes at a price. That's why it's called congestion pricing, and that generates revenues which will be reinvested in the transport system and I'd imagine eventually take over from Auckland Regional Fuel Tax. The other critical element for the board is that the introduction of congestion charges coincides with the availability of enhanced alternative mode opportunities. And I think that's a key part of the timing of this. We've got massive investments the council have made and the governments have made coming on stream in 4 or 5 years' time. And certainly my feeling, having been involved in this kind of thinking for a long time, is if we miss that opportunity, we could wait decades for another to make the case to our communities that this is a good thing to do because alternatives are in place. And the board also discussed and acknowledged that if there were any residual hardship for different parts of the community because of implementing of this, then that had to be addressed as part of the overall proposal. So, Mr. Chairman, I think that summarises the board's view. It sees this as the work done by the project team as a really strong contribution to what is regarded as an essential toolkit that we need to add to our capability as a transport authority.
Thank you, Wayne. Look, we'll put up the recommendations so that the members can see the recommendations, which, and there's something in red, and I'll move and the Mayor will second. We'll put those up if the members can just start reading those. But just a question for you, Wayne, or Shane. Shane, you might know this detail. So the technical report, which sits under the main findings report, is proposing, subject to decisions and more scoping and examination, at earliest 25 implementation of a trial scheme, I think and then possibly unfolding more fully 28. Shane, I just wanted to ask you, I've got my list of the infrastructure programs, projects that we'll have rolled out by 2025. I've got CRL, Eastern Busway, Third Main electrification to Pookie, Northwest Busway, ferry procurement strategy with electric ferries, advanced e-bus rollout, we will be advanced, Northern Busway enhancements, 500 million there, that'll be complete, 9-car train sets, Watamata connections, that will be, we would have landed a decision by then on rapid transit to the shore, commencing admittedly in 2030. Plus, bus network reviews, they're ongoing. You would have refreshed the network on probably more than 2 occasions by then. A bus shelter program, I think it's something like 1,000 shelters. What else? By 2025, have I missed anything that comes to mind?
Probably the other one to be aware of, which is really relevant to the strategic corridors option in here, is the Connected Communities program.
Yes.
I, like Wayne, I really commend the project team, of which David from Council and Brian from AT and Jared have all been a part of. But the ability to stage rollout will really, you can make it feels real when you talk about connected communities along those strategic corridors, particularly through the isthmus. So I think that's another key piece, Chair.
It is, thank you. Let's have some questions. I think we need to enter this inquiry, not that we're just starting it. And Mayor Goff, would you like to commence?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think it's a really competent report, and it does exactly what you are asked to do, and it gives us a basis for making a decision. It doesn't give us a basis yet to know whether we've got public support for it, but that's the next phase. I've got 2 questions. One I've raised to David with you personally, but I'll raise it in the presence of councillors. The social assessment mitigation, that's pretty critical, because for a small, maybe not too small a section of low-income people coming down the motorway into town, this is going to be much, much higher than they're paying in regional fuel tax. The question is this: you've listed the community services card as a way of delivering relief, but the community services card, as I understand it, only applies to those earning less than the minimum wage. So you have, if you use that mechanism, not included any low-income worker, and it won't be the community services card people that are travelling in peak hours, it'll be the low-income workers. So the question is this: how much thought did the working group give to providing relief to that group, which I regard as pretty much an essential prerequisite to bringing in the congestion tax? And what sort of mechanism, did you give thought to what sort of mechanism you might be able to use to provide that relief? That's the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I suppose that I mentioned to you is, yep, there was a lot of work done. And there's more work to be done. I suppose there was also considering for the working families sort of packages as well. So I think what you've highlighted there is that we've indicated some schemes that could be used, but there is more work required to really get to the bottom of, as you say, those working families, working households, that this is going to have a significant impact on them. And that has come through in the 50 interviews that we've done. We've got some examples of exactly that. So that will be a part of the phase 3 to get to the bottom of that.
Well, that's good to hear, because I don't think you can do the scheme unless you provide the relief, but I'd hate not to do the scheme on the basis that there will be some people that are hurt by it, but then the rest of us, that's the price of travelling in peak hour. My second question is this: you touched on it, but I think if you introduce a congestion tax on top of the regional fuel tax, there would be enormous cynicism that this was just a revenue grab. So how much thought did you give about the other prerequisite I've got, which is you'd need to phase out the regional fuel tax as you were phasing in the congestion tax?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, that's exactly right. That would be a decision for for your final decision is how you do that. And some of it is really dependent on that decision of the size of that initial scheme that you go for, sort of thing. So in effect, it will be a case of, if it's a small scheme, obviously the revenues from that scheme would be low. You'd want the scheme to pay for itself a bit. So any difference, you could either make a decision to reinvest in PT, or you could reduce your after. That is a key decision for the future. So I suppose at this stage, this work outlines the options that you have before that final decision.
Yeah, you'd need to at least return the revenue that the regional fuel tax is through your scheme. But if you load one on top of the other, I'm afraid the public will, as much as you can spend the money, I'm sure the public would just regard that cynically and probably not go for it. So I think we need to be straight up front that that's what we'd do. And I use the words in a measured way, phase in, phase out.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Fletcher, please.
Well, thank you. And firstly, may I congratulate everyone that's here today that has actually brought this most important issue to us. And I would like to acknowledge Wayne Donnelly. I remember standing in this very room and making a speech to him as he farewelled Auckland City and congratulating him on the courageous endeavours that he's had and the consistency that I now see. I mean, this issue, earlier today, I highlighted when we had employers and manufacturers here, that we looked at water charging at the same time as we started talking about congestion charging. Both were really controversial. One we got through and one we didn't. So my question to you today, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for actually, because people liberally use the word courageous around this table, and I sometimes get a bit snorty about it because it is hard to push things over many, many years, and Wayne, you have done that. But this is an act of real courage today, but the question is, if not now, when? Because nothing I can see is going to have that fundamental shift unless, and for all of those of us who pushed for CRL and everything else, this was a critical factor in having the jigsaw puzzle come together. So I would like you to respond in terms of, we have a government with a big majority at the moment, the conditions that are required to bring this critical matter to a head.
Thank you, Councillor. I suppose a key decision going forward in the third phase is the change of legislation. So we can't do congestion charging without modification of the Land Transport Management Act or new legislation. So government has a big role in that final decision sort of thing. But the way I think about these sort of schemes is, I suppose a big what I've looked overseas is that many cities now have done it. Many cities are thinking about it. And I think the reason they're thinking about it is that they've come to the sort of conclusion, I think this work has shown, that if you want to address these issues, if you don't have these sort of options in your toolkit, you can't really do it. And I think that's the bottom line. So and I think the other thing is a lot of cities in the world are now realising that without having this type of thing in the toolkit, you can't afford not to have it. The demand for ongoing transport network capacity is terrific. Unless you can modify or manage that need for that demand, you will be caught in a cycle of just increased costs. And I think if you've seen through the LTP or 10-year budget process that you've been working on, the cost for bringing on new capacity into the transport network is terrific. And if you don't have this in the toolkit, that will continue. So ultimately with these things, someone always pays, it's just who pays. So having a charging scheme where you get people to think about making that decision at the moment they get in their car, it makes a big difference. And just reflect on that. In the Stockholm example, it's got a name for it. It's called the Stockholm effect, where they asked people afterwards what had changed and what for them. They actually couldn't remember a lot of the trips they used to make because when they faced the price, it just changed their behaviours, and they couldn't remember. These trips literally disappeared, and the network was open more free. So I think around the world, these sort of options are becoming far more up people's minds because there's realisation you just can't build your way out of these sort of problems.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Naturally, we have to tease out the detail of issues of equity for folk, and I'm often very critical of the way that we waste time in this chamber on things that, are not that higher, in my mind anyway, in terms of priorities. But this is it's a real circuit breaker today, and I think it's good that we're spending a bit of time on it, and I really congratulate you for bringing it to us, and I hope beyond hope that we can adopt it unanimously and have the government understand why Auckland, if New Zealand is to succeed, why Auckland desperately needs that legislative change now, and that's why I keep harping on about advocacy. We have to improve our advocacy. We must get this across the line.
So true, Councillor Fletcher. Thank you. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. Congratulations on this. I just want to say, Your Worship, the two issues that you mentioned that concerned me was the Community Services Card, but also, gosh, it's just sort of gone out at the moment. There was the fuel tax, because when that was brought in, there was on the understanding that if congestion charging was going to occur, that is going to be not as well as that. So look, that's one thing. My question is, however, with this and the government indicating possibly 2025, with this third stage, will the information we're collating now be redundant, that it's not going to be worth anything when we get to at least the ability for the government to put in congestion charging? I see Shane shaking his head no, which is a good thing. But so look, that's one thing. And then I've got one other question. Thanks.
Who's going to handle that one? Brian or Jared or?
I mean, Shane might be able to. He just said no, it's not. So. Yeah.
I mean, obviously the COVID we've had a little impact in terms of traffic patterns, but I mean, just anecdotally, we're already seeing traffic ramping back up, and I think that there's when I talk to people about this, I kind of explain to them that if you just kind of think about the cumulative impact of population growth in Auckland, it's overwhelming, really. And because we have a very constrained, geography in terms of our isthmus and the two harbors, it is very difficult to add road capacity, and it's extremely expensive. So I think that the work we've done and the foundation will still be relevant, and the long-term trend is for the situation to just get increasingly worse, and we'll see what's happened overseas, which is that the interpeak just starts to disappear, and the peaks just start earlier and finish later.
Yeah, maybe I can add to that as well. There's, when I came back last committee meeting, when I presented on the additional Wairarapa Harbour connections work, in which projected, we could sort of see, even with the COVID-19 and thinking in the longer term, these congestion conditions were still significant, and that did need to bring on new capacity. So I think, it's very hard to predict that COVID effect, but over time, all the planning is that we will return to similarly normal sort of situations. So it's long and short of it is, you wouldn't want to limit your toolkit based on some of those uncertainties around that.
Okay, and the final question is, are we doing this work so then if the change of legislation becomes a reality, and the work gets started at central government level? Are we doing this work as per the report saying that the government want Auckland Council support? Is this the reason we're doing the work? And sorry, Chair, just to throw in this last question, but and it's going to be together, is that when I read the spin-off article they did in 2017, there were quite a few issues they identified, saying if we end up as an Auckland Council and Auckland Transport fixing some of these, like Auckland public transport, that the ask for the congestion may be redundant. Thank you, and that's it.
I suppose just to respond to that, in terms of working together, and I suppose fundamentally to do congestion charging in Auckland, it requires multiple agencies. So that's always been the premise of why we've worked together. You need legislative change in terms of which is a primary government mandate, but they've made it very clear that without the support of Auckland Council, government would not do such legislation. It needs the support of council, and it also needs the involvement of Auckland Transport and NZTA to ensure that we're all aligned. So that's why we're sort of working together. So for any final decision, if say for example in a world where Auckland Council didn't support, the option to have the congestion charge in Auckland, it'd be very, it would be hard to see that government would go forward. So we've got a key role in that final decision.
Thank you, Councillor Filipaina. And Councillor Casey.
Do you know the wonderful thing about democracy is that Christine Fletcher and I represent the same ward, and we'd probably be this far apart in terms of this particular issue. And it might not be a question. I'll try and think of a question. But the signing off ATAP, I didn't realise I was actually signing off investigation into road pricing. So that's how far back this goes. So now this is more honest, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not honest enough, because we haven't talked to the people of Auckland. And I've seen the resolution that the chair has put up there that we're going to do some consultation. Well, that's fantastic. The people most affected by this are the people who think they've already paid for their petrol, their car and their roads. And the only way that you're going to get more money out of me is if it's a revenue gathering exercise. It's highway robbery. That's what I've heard my whole life. So if this was simply a cordon around the city centre, I could probably be talked into that, because I'd like to see all the cars out of the city centre. So that would help. But I still remember Stephen Selwood coming to us back in 2017 and trying to sell us what was then called the motorway network charge, which I think that's what this is, but with different words. It's a motorway network charge. It's not. It's some kind. Well, the motorways are included, because he said State Highway 1 and State Highway 16 as one of the strategic corridor options, correct? So that is a motorway network charge.
Yeah, what the Infrastructure New Zealand proposed was cumulative charges just on the motorways, which of course would be very, very inequitable for the outer households. This is just a single charge. And the other problem with the Infrastructure New Zealand proposal was that they weren't talking about charging arterial roads, which of course the only thing you're going to do is then drive all the traffic from the motorways into your local communities.
I do understand that. I was just putting that up as that was the monster came out of the mist. The monster hasn't entirely gone back into the mist, because I don't really understand the second part of this, which is a revenue gathering exercise. You are going to make money from it. You've said that, $200 million possibly. So that it is a revenue gathering exercise. So what I'd like to see now, I was so glad I heard the mayor yesterday on the radio talking about this is not coming anytime soon, that before it comes, there has to be good alternatives. See, that's what these people who drive into our city haven't got. They haven't got choice. You might have talked to 50 people, and I don't know what they said to you, but I can guarantee you if you offered them an option, they would say no to a network charge of any kind. They've already paid. And I'm sure that's what, you didn't say what they said to you, but I would suggest that none of them are very keen on this idea. Because $7 when you're only getting a $7 cap, when you only get paid $20 an hour, It's a hell of a lot of money. So we look at the mayor. The work hasn't been done yet, as the mayor has rightly pointed out, on the vast majority of people who can't afford to pay this. And that's where I'm interested in. So I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure.
Would you like me to respond to that, or, I mean,
Yes, please.
in a couple of things. I'd really invest the time having a look at the actual report on the MOT site of the 50 people that was interviewed, and it's quite interesting. And the truth is, it's a bit mixed. For some people, it is a real burden and would be very difficult. For some people, it wasn't the case. So I think one of the challenges, I suppose, I really think is that individually it does fall a bit different depending on the circumstance of those trips. That's the first thing. The other thing to think about in terms of, I suppose, low-income road users is that the current conditions in terms of congestion has problems for them as well. In terms of access to jobs, often they're spending very long, more than what we think is ideal time in the car to a trip. One of the benefits of these schemes is that the number of jobs come available within a 30-minute drive increases. So in terms of access to opportunity, it does increase. There is a lot of psychological and stress benefits that come from congestion. So there's no doubt that, there are issues that for low-income people now. But I suppose what I take out of this work, and this is the key thing, that what it means for vulnerable users, which are low-income people that cannot change the course of their behaviour, sort of thing, is that it needs to be front and mind of such schemes. So I suppose in terms of the final decision, that needs to be really thoroughly understood and debated. In terms of a discussion with Auckland, that's absolutely critical, and one of the recommendations going forward is that most of these schemes do not go forward because of the public acceptability, primarily because a lot of people think they're unfair. So there needs to be quite a bit of discussion around that. But again, what's really interesting in terms of Stockholm, I suppose, at first some of the support was low, but post the actual implementation of the support went up a lot higher. So I suppose what this work is saying is that if you put the effort in, there are ways you can look at these, try to manage these issues.
Supplementary, in what way will you engage with the people of Auckland? What's the intention?
Well, that's really the next work, I suppose. So what we're suggesting in this resolution is that this work gets scoped, which includes how we would consult with the people of Auckland, and we bring that back to this committee and to government before we go forward, because that was what we really need to clarify. So we just haven't really got to that level of detail yet.
So that will be for us to confirm, Councillor Casey, and that's going to be absolutely critical. Can I just follow up a supplementary to Councillor Casey, and maybe Brian or Jared, please contribute here. In the report, and then I did go and read most of the technical report, which is 140 pages, it talked quite regularly about modest impacts. There were social impacts, but they were modest. Maybe you can just expand on that. But also the question of it being a revenue gatherer. The technical report makes it really clear that you cannot implement a revenue gathering scheme. There is revenue collected, and there's a difference between a so-called revenue gathering scheme. Now, London was introduced as a congestion pricing and busting scheme. It's unfortunately changed to a revenue gathering scheme. Stockholm has not done that, Gothenburg not, Singapore not. Can you just explain the difference between what's occurred in London, where they've now gone for revenue, having started not like that, and Stockholm and the others that have maintained the primary focus being congestion, behaviour change rather than revenue gathering?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I think our objective, if you think about it, if you have the objective of basically improving network performance outcomes as opposed to revenue, then your goal is going to be to set the lowest possible charge to meet your network performance outcomes. Now, we've suggested that the sort of school holiday impact, which is sort of an 8 to 12% improvement in network performance using a bunch of different metrics, is realistic for Auckland. Gothenburg was very similar. They had a similar PT mode share. Our mode share for some corridors is actually very high now. It's approaching 50% for public transport and active modes. And so what we're proposing with the phasing is that essentially the introduction follows the capacity. But the other interesting thing is that if you look at, particularly in Sweden, which of course they've got the best data there, being Swedish, essentially a huge number of trips, as David alluded to, just simply disappeared. So there was out of 20 percentage points, about 9, I think, switched to public transport, and then 2 or 3 changed time, and the balance just disappeared. And so if you think about it, in the Auckland context, we have a lot of, there is still a lot of discretionary trips, and so the scheme, is about targeting those, not targeting people who are essentially unable to, to shift mode or time. And whereas a revenue gathering scheme would, of course, be just looking to essentially target people with essentially a very low price elasticity in economic terms.
So just going forward, I think it's really important that we get it clear. We are not developing a revenue gathering scheme, even though we are collecting revenue. And I think in the scoping, we need to give some certainty that we won't end up like London, becoming a revenue gathering congestion pricing scheme. Now that's going to be subject to future decision makers that sit around these tables. But I think it's something that we need to examine in the next stage.
Just to reinforce that, Chair, I suppose when the original terms of reference was put together, demand management was the clear purpose for this project. It's never been a revenue gathering type aim.
Okay. Councillor Collins, I'm very conscious that you've got a meeting commitment elsewhere. Are you with us now online, and would you like to pose your question, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And so I think my questions have all been summed up, and so I'll just make a quick comment. Thanks. I think the Mayor summed it up, because the question I was going to ask was about how there's a difference in, I guess, kind of income thresholds between a low-income worker who'd be using the roads and the person who holds a community services card. So yeah, that's a question we'll need to consider, and I like your, I think it's your recommendation F that's gone into the considerations too. So yeah, I'm glad that the discussion's been had. I need to be convinced, because I am extremely weary of the social impacts, which have already been talked about alongside the Mayor Councillors Casey and Filipaina. So thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed the discussion. I remain a little bit weary, but I'm glad that you've got F in there, Sue, because it's really going to help the next report, if this goes through, to really drive home a clear understanding of the social and the socio-economic impacts for those more vulnerable commuters. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Collins, and thanks for staying with us. Councillor Henderson, please.
Thanks. Just before I ask my questions, we're coming back to comments after questions, I take it?
Yes, and I've taken a few comments because I'm conscious that some councillors needed to drop off the line.
That's cool. All right, well, I reserve my right to speak. We're putting a lot of, with respect, putting a lot of stock in Stockholm. What's their public transport coverage like in Stockholm?
It's about, I think their mode share is close between 20 to 25%. But equally, they achieved a 20 to 25% reduction in traffic. So to give you some context. So Gothenburg had a mode share which is similar overall to Auckland, and they achieved about a 12-13% improvement in network performance. So there is a correlation.
Okay, I just mean in terms of physical coverage. I've seen maps of Stockholm's public transport network. I just looked it up. Doesn't look like Auckland, that's for sure.
And we're not saying that we're looking to achieve what Stockholm achieved.
Okay, cool. Just a couple of other questions supplementary. Paragraph 29 in the report, is there any reason why you did not mention the Northwest?
Was it? Oh, yeah. Definitely, when we wrote the report, there was no real reason for not mentioning it. No. Yeah. Yeah. That would be.
It's not an exhaustive list of all the public transport. I did, earlier, Shane confirmed a list, but we didn't actually go into the active transport program or anything like that.
There was no intention to. Sorry.
And the Mayor did mention it, Shane and Linda.
Merely asking intention and the question's been answered.
I can answer that for you. The report was actually finished before the shovel ready. It's been sitting for a long period of time, that report. And obviously the interim improvements were announced in July or something like that, in terms of Northwest.
So this report was authored, that's interesting, I didn't prepare this question. This report was authored before we had any solution on the Northwest, is that true?
Yes, a lot of the work has been done over a period of 2 years. It's been an ongoing piece of work.
I'm stunned, I might need to move on. Okay, just one last question. You have suggested that people need to start thinking about whether they need to drive to the city in peak. Would you accept that people are doing it already? They're already thinking that?
Definitely, people have already responded, and and that's why I always say to people when they ask me about rat running, and I'm like, well, rat running, it's already happening. People have already trying to work that out, and of course, again, that's why we're looking for, our first objective is just that low-hanging fruit. I mean, you probably may not have seen the latest census data, but a full 50% of 17-year-olds are now driving to school. There's no wonder there's a school holiday effect. Do they need to be driving to school at peak periods? I think the answer is probably most of them don't. So I think, if the cost of motoring is very, very low, then obviously people are still going to be prepared to, travel at peak periods, even when they don't need to.
Thanks, Councillor Henderson. Councillor Dalton, please.
Thank you. Look, I support the recommendations, specifically C, which is moving to the next phase or scoping. I wondered if there might be a further opportunity to submit thoughts for the scoping document. I can see that you've covered off a couple that have been raised under E and F. I just think that sounds like people have more thoughts around that, or it'd be good to have that information before bringing it back to us, and then we relitigate it all again.
David, can I just go to you on the scoping document? So if you go down to the G members, G, yes, we'll have regular reporting. Even if there is nothing for us to learn that requires a decision, we'll get an update via memo. So this is about staying over the top of it politically. We will. On the scoping document?
Look, the process for scoping has just begun, and there's been quite a bit of work done in the past. So, look, I'm sure that as we get closer to, wanting to agree the scoping, I mean, if it's, we could have a workshop, or we could have a way to get some input before, very open, because, it was interesting before I had just to talk to the IMSB Chief Executive was quite keen to have input into the scoping as well. So, look, I'll go back and say that we've built in some opportunities to input into it.
The answer is we will. Okay.
I did have another question. In the documents that are on the Transport website, is there one outside of the 50 people that you interviewed that gives an indication of who are travelling to town, to the city border?
Yep, thank you for the question. It's in the options development. There's an options development paper, and there's a whole lot of supporting material, and it's got it in there. I think it breaks it down from memory by local board in terms of the splits of who's coming to the city centre.
In terms of who, does it identify students, working people, travel, couriers, that level? I'm just trying to get to what the Mayor was talking about and Councillor Casey, who is driving into the city centre.
I mean, since we finished this report, the new census data has been released. I mean, obviously there was some issues around the census data, but it nevertheless has still got a lot of updated materials. That forms the basis for rebasing the Auckland forecasting traffic model. So I think that we will be in a better position. Having said that, the model we built to do the social assessment, we modeled, every household in Auckland by size and income and characteristic. So we have that baseline data and the model that's been built that will need updating. But it's surprising actually how short the journeys are. There's actually not a lot of long distance commuting happening in Auckland relative to other urban centres. The average size trip is average length trip is only 12 kilometres, but 50% of trips are less than 5 kilometres. And again, all that data is in the technical report.
You will need to trend some data from the impacts of COVID and people not coming into the centre anymore, working from home.
For sure. I mean, there's definitely been an impact. I think that some of that will be sustained, but you've obviously got a context of a growing city. Again, Auckland doesn't have a huge in-out CBD kind of pattern. We're only talking about 15% of jobs and actually a relatively small number of trips compared to the trips that are taking place across the whole network. That's why if we want to make this be very effective, we need to kind of go to some kind of strategic corridor scheme. That's what happened in Singapore as they evolved the scheme. They started off with quite a smaller CBD-based scheme, but they've moved it out towards the corridors, and they target a preferred travel time and speed.
That's really interesting. Chris, I just have one comment and then you don't have to come back to me. And it's around the revenue generating aspect of it, because any income that's generated is hypothecated to replace the work that's been done by the regional fuel tax and also perhaps public transport improvements. I think it's important that story is told very well. But in addition to that, the report on a cost-benefit analysis on the Transport website talks about the 6 benefits, and they are important because they must be pretty much top of mind of people. So the benefits are travel time, travel reliability, reduction in congested travel time, vehicle operating costs, CO2 emissions, and other emissions. That's the goal. That's the end game, and I think that is what needs to be promoted as strongly as possible. Although, of course, people will be looking at it as a revenue-generating exercise. How do we tell that story a bit better? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Watson?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you for a very clear presentation. I mean, remarkably clear and concise and in its own way quite persuasive. My question, the first question goes to those parts of Auckland that might be paying tolls. So, for instance, we've got a couple of projects where people are paying tolls. Do those communities get built into the $7 limit for the day, or do they pay their $7 limit and then their toll on top of that?
Good question. We haven't factored that into the analysis, but I think if there was an extension, I'm thinking Whangapā Roa, obviously, the bridge out there. I think that would be, we would need to talk about that. I mean, so generally speaking, we weren't thinking that we would, the motorways would be included in the first instance. But I think if you move to a more geographically dispersed scheme, then that's a very valid point.
Just in terms of that data, that. And the suggestion that how nuanced this might actually be once you start looking at, individual families and where they might come from. I mean, on the face of it, if you look at someone who was getting caught with the $7 limit, at $35 a week or whatever, 50 weeks of the year, that's like $1,750. One person, if there's a couple of people in that family, then it's it's up to $3,500, which starts to get real big time. the regional fuel tax comparison, you know, that I don't know, that's probably maybe $5 a week or in the vicinity of that per household member. So there's a huge big gap there. I guess, you know, being a representative of one of the further out wards, which you might be conceivably hit harder by this, how are you going to get, you know, and I'm thinking in terms of the public consultation, that nuanced effect that might occur from people altering their behaviour. So we do want, and this is about altering behaviour. How do we get that built in to the consultation and the realistic assessment back from people then of how it will affect them? Because clearly, if you've got people affected to that worst case, that's just unfair and prohibitive. But if we take in, well, we want you to change your behaviour, you have to change your behaviour. This isn't about money, it's about our city going forward. How do we get that built into someone's response to us in terms of, well, actually, I don't need to go to work to 9:30 or whatever, really, and that's what I would do. So it seems to me to be a real challenge to get a real effect, a sense of how the effect might be and how it might not be as bad as perhaps is being suggested.
Maybe I can respond to that a bit. I mean, I think the first part of that in terms of consultation, and I think the report does outline some key principles of what the scheme is trying to do and some of the key things that would be applied. And I suppose one of them is, it goes, you know, is around having the PT alternatives. So, I mean, as Brian has mentioned, the scheme is not there to penalise people who cannot change their behaviour. I think this is the big thing we have to get through to the public. It's to make people think before they get in their vehicle, do they really need to do this trip, sort of thing. So that's what this is all about. And a lot of the time, as Brian said, with a lot of these discretionary trips, it turns out, and the Stockholm shows this, actually people didn't need to make it at that time, whatever. So it changed. So I think there are some additional principles that we need to apply. It has to be very clear that it's, you know, you're not aiming at penalising people who honestly cannot change their behaviour. This is what it's about. So that's come through quite strongly. And I suppose, you know, then it's really trying to say that for those who really can't change their behaviour and it's going to affect you, there is things that can help mitigate that. So I think there's quite an important story around that. And in terms of, I suppose, you know, for people that are further out in the region, I think having the fact that these alternatives, until you have these alternatives, they wouldn't be applied is a part of that story, because you want to have people options. This is part of giving them options to make that decision. It's not a scheme like a revenue raising scheme would be. You have no options, we just take the revenue. So you have to get that. That's the trick, I suppose. But you're right. It's going to take some good thinking how to explain that, because you know the first reaction to a lot of people will be, oh, I can't change behaviour. It's going to really hurt me. But overseas, the experience shows that often they do, and they can't even remember the previous behaviour with time.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Walker.
So, got a few questions, no particular order. I guess commendation. In one general context, quite obviously, this sort of move also applies to power, applies to water. We've got peak issues across Auckland with everything. So in principle, I think there's a larger setting. The other concern that I've got, that I put to you as a question, is just around, climate emergency, switching to EVs. Making the assumption that you've identified that obviously if you're identifying a number plate, that correlates with whether it's an EV, a hybrid or whatever. So it's useful to have some commentary around that. The other concern that I've got that just goes to the context around PT alternatives. The other substitute for a trip is communications, because if somebody can work at home, if they can communicate, it's a direct substitute for travel. So the larger context is, for example, if you're looking at smart cities, around free Wi-Fi and other things. So I think it's implicit to actually have that information in the alternatives. And then the other issue around Auckland as various people have identified, is there are chunks of Auckland that don't have access to public transport. So if you look at my area with Councillor Watson, some of those people, a lot of them are dependent on park and rides, but park and ride capacity is limited and we're not expanding it. So is that sort of issue going to be confronted in terms of the public transport alternative? And then the other larger context is essentially this whole issue is around promoting choice. We're applying a stick to do that, but the other thing around choice, particularly in the sort of technological and communication-based society we've got, is we could be applying a lot more information around choice. So when is it quicker to travel because there isn't a peak congestion problem? Information around car sharing and other things. So there's a bundle of things that we could and should be doing that go to this that I just toss in. And then the related question I've got that has to be of concern to the government is with what is inevitable around a massive shift to EVs, how is government going to collect revenue? So what is the mechanism that government is going to use to collect revenue from people driving vehicles, because that's an incredibly important source of revenue, and how does that tie in with this, not just for Auckland but New Zealand as a whole? So a few questions there. I don't need any answers necessarily, but if you can just pick up on them, that's useful. Thanks.
David, primarily, I'm sure you take some notes there.
I think one of the findings of the work was, the travel demand management has, a number of facets to it. And when we did the option analysis, we did look at a range of more transport-orientated other mechanisms like PT fares, car sharing. So I suppose, while this work has been more focused than what you've been talking about, Councillor, it would be part of this travel demand management package. So I think that's good thoughts there. And in terms of how it links into broader government work, well, I am aware that the Ministry of Transport is doing a future of transport revenue sort of project, which is, I suppose, trying to think about some of these more fundamental factors where, which is really a substitution away from fossil fuel vehicles sort of thing. So while there's been some connection and awareness of that, it hasn't been a primary part of this project.
Thank you, David, and good points, and we need to collate those points of feedback, please. Councillor Stewart, please.
Thank you. A lot of the questions I was going to ask have been asked, but lack of car parking in the CBD, we seem to be getting rid of a lot of car parking, and so a lot of people that I speak to thinking about taking their businesses out of the CBD and Parnell. I know my daughter works in Parnell, and what happens in the business that she's working in, there's, I don't know, about 100 staff or something like that, or more, and every 2 hours they all have to go, because of the lack of car parking, they have to go and move their cars. So every 2 hours, one of them will say to the Mary next door, hey, Joseph's moving his car, you go down, then Jonathan, you better go down and you better go and move your car. And so what's happening is, people are all having to, so a lot of people, this congestion, I'm not totally against congestion charging. I, many years ago, lived in Singapore and experienced the early part of it, but I am really concerned that a lot of people are now not wanting to work in the CBD as much. And I think, looking at Commercial Bay, I just heard on the radio just last night, people were saying that Commercial Bay is really, really struggling because people aren't wanting to come into the CBD because they can't get car parking, or car parking is now getting too expensive. So if we're going to start having congestion charging and, all these things, it's just going to be... So I'm just pointing that out because it's very, very real. And I think what will end up happening if we're not careful with the CBD, if we take all the car parking away and we make it really, really expensive for everybody, and everybody has to keep running in and out You know, you just imagine us all having to run in and out every couple of hours to move our cars. People are going to move out of the CBD, and it'll only be people that are living in the CBD, and you won't have any congestion charging because they'll all be just walking around and riding their bikes and their scooters. Thank you.
Sounds like a good future. Thank you, Councillor Stewart. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks, David and team. Great presentation, and I really enjoyed it. The question, I think a lot of it's been answered. You know, this is a zero-sum game. So we start off with the CBD, so they're doing $75 million a year as a Cordon. Then we cut the fuel tax in half, and as we grow it out, so the fuel tax gets cut till it disappears. That's the basic principle, is it not? Yeah.
That's right. I mean, as the Mayor indicated, I mean, obviously that is a decision for the committee in the final decision. But, you know, one option you have is that as you raise revenue from a congestion scheme, you would reduce your regional fuel tax to ensure that there was, you know, parallel reduction.
That's an absolutely key principle. When people were going ape on social media about this when it got out public earlier this week, I put back and said it's a zero-sum game, guys. It comes off fuel tax. One guy came back who was being really vociferous and just said, "Oh, that's okay then." So that was quite an amusing thing. The other point that hasn't been brought up here is, what if we don't do this? So Shane, you know, the road transport's still going up faster than PT, and what would it cost to double deck the southern or the western or the northern motorways?
It's a big number, Deputy Mayor.
I don't have enough noughts in my calculator to figure that out.
No. There's a presentation coming in a minute which will give you a sense of why we need this on top of the ATAP investment.
That's where I'm going. So the rationale behind this is it's actually an inevitability because we have to do something like this to get the congestion down. It improves people's quality of life and improves productivity. Not doing it and being in denial is not an answer because it will get to a point where we have traffic Armageddon, and some places we have that now, that we just grind the whole place to a shuddering halt. And even Dallas and Fort Worth learned that lesson, didn't they? So the challenge is going to be in the comms and getting the public understanding level to rise. And if people's and companies change where they operate their business from, their business will still operate. They'll just be somewhere else where they find it more preferable because there is a less congested environment. That's probably good for Councillor Watson's area. It might be good for mine as well. Quite happy for having that happen. A bit more regional economic activity. In fact, there's more people live and work in the south now than what do in the CBD by quite some considerable margin. The other last point I'd make of a relation of mine rings me up about once, or used to ring me up about once a week, and they were driving through at 8:25 from Oraki, Kohimarama, I think he lives, through Mission Bay, and ring me up and give me an absolute earful about the congestion. And I'd say, Charlie, don't ring me up on your bloody car phone when you're driving on Mission Bay at peak hour traffic on your own in your car, because Charlie, you are the bloody problem. Clunk. And Charlie did stop ringing up after a while, but
Charlie's not a constituent. No, unfair of me. Good on you. Councillor Cooper, please.
Thank you. One of my questions is when we talk about having exemptions because of different levels of either socio-economic or area, how hard is it to create a system where you have lots of exemptions? You know, because we know that things like GST, everyone says the best system is the simple one-off system.
Thanks. That's a good question. When you get a chance to read the report, we were very much actually our first principles is that we are trying to avoid exemptions. That's what's undermined the London scheme, amongst other things. And so what we're talking about, it's really, you know, ex post mitigations. Well, you know, after people have made those decisions, after people have paid. As opposed to creating exemptions. So at the moment, the only vehicles classes we're talking about being exempt are essentially passenger transport vehicles, motorcycles, scooters, bikes. Trident.
So I've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to comment because actually we're all getting really hungry and we've still got a big meeting to go. So for me, one of the issues when we talk about vulnerable people is we talk about people on low incomes. I'm actually more concerned about young professional people who get driven further and further out. You know, they're paying, somebody just sold a house, just a little old house, it's in West Harbour, but 1.57 million, you know, these are considered first homes, 20 odd K out of Auckland, the hilt on their mortgage, it's not how much they earn, it's what what income is left. And we're not taking into account those young people who are trying, I can't even have a baby yet, can't do this, just trying really hard. But we never talk about those people. Those are our younger people who are kind of our future. So we're not even factoring them in, but they're the ones that are paying the taxes, they're doing all that, they're going to paying rates, they're paying the mortgages, doesn't matter how much interest rates they are, they're pushed to the hilt on two incomes. And so that's what I worry about. Plus, some of them are living in areas with, you know, they might live in live in Avondale, but work at the airport or in that precinct. It's nearly an hour and a half on the bus. They either have to go all the way into town and then all the way out to, or all the way through Onehunga to get an alternative. The alternatives aren't even appealing, but we're talking about a network charge, so that would be, they normally might go through the tunnel or down a motorway or go down the Northwestern motorway if they live in Massey. And those are the things that I'm not feeling that I feel confident. The people that presented to us earlier, he just texted me his plan for light rail. He said it will be there in 2040 up the Northwestern, 20 years away. You know, so I'm kind of not confident that if we had the whole network charge, you say we'll do it in the end, but we're not, you know, and Shane has done some really good work with his staff on a Northwestern busway, but it's still not great. It's still really inadequate and it's not a viable choice for a lot of people. So that's the things that I will vote for this to go out and have all this work done, but it's going to take a lot of convincing for me that the people that I represent, and particularly Massey, Northwest, people like that in the southwestern part of Upper Harbour, that are actually going to see any benefit. It's just going to cost them more because they're pushed out further, the younger people, to buy a house. I'm not worried about the people that are on the, you know, pretty much on some sort of benefit because they're not going to make these trips. You know, they don't pay, and if they live in Housing New Zealand, they don't pay rates. But it's these people. The other thing that I'm not comfortable with, we talk about phasing in and phasing of fuel tax. For me, it's one or the other. Because while you're still forced with no decent RTN to go into the city or use the network, you're going to be paying that charge and you're paying fuel tax. So, you know, I feel incredibly let down by the whole fuel tax thing because it hasn't delivered what I voted for, which was RTN in the Northwest. It's supposed to be all happening by 2021, where December 2020, you know, so to me, it's just another impost for people that don't have a choice. And so that's, unless there's another choice, it'd be hard for me to support it. But I'm interested in seeing this extra work. You know, it's a really good piece of work, but it's still going to disadvantage people. And it won't just be the lowest income. It's really around people with the least amount of spare money to do anything with. And we're seeing with the house prices, the people that do get in the market, they're to the hilt already.
Thank you. And look, the Deputy Mayor he articulated it quite well. There's an expectation that if the first phase comes in, the revenue gathered from that would be offset by a reduction in the regional fuel tax immediately. And so we'll explore that through the scope as we progress things. I want to go to Councillor Simpson, please.
Thanks, Mr Chair. A couple of quick questions. CRL, all things being equal, 2024, so you have a year of CRL without a congestion charge. How long does it take for behaviour? So first of all, the CRL opens, and then you'll get people getting ready to use the CRL, and then they'll start using it, and that will, build it and they will come sort of scenario. Then if you put the congestion charge on, when will you expect to see the change? Certainly it's not immediate, is it?
Well, it's quite interesting because I suppose, in terms of a price, I suppose, you'd imagine the change would be quite quickly, because the way you think about it very basically, if you had one day where a supermarket, everything was free, you'd have a lot of queues in there. The next day, all the prices went on, things would change reasonably quickly. So I think the anticipation is that you do get results quite quickly, because it really goes to the essence of, human behaviour. If you know that you're going to face a charge before you get in your car, you probably the first little while go, okay, well, I'll probably get around that. But when you realise you can't get around it, then the behaviour will change. So my expectation is you'd have quite a rapid change.
So is that based on your opinion or what's happened elsewhere when it's come in overseas?
Yeah, the changes that have happened overseas happen immediately.
Thank you, that's the answer. My second question is the engagement with Aucklanders. Do we as councillors have an opportunity to input into what and how that looks like?
So if you look at the, where is it, the E, so this is the scope that we talked about before, and David and the team, remember, we're dealing with a number of agencies here, government and council, we'll be developing that scope up and we'll be checking in on that scope. So the engagement plan, we'll get to have a look at that, and the G mentions that there's going to be quite regular reporting on this. It's important that we stay, as I said, politically right over the top of it. Okay, enough questions, and there have been great questions. And look, at the outset, I really want to thank David. You've just taken us through this journey here today in a brilliant way, actually. Azim, not forgetting your writing of the report, in a PwC, Auckland Transport, through Brian. Look, I'm just really, really grateful for the thoroughness of the not just the report, but everything that sits under this report. Look, I can't help but think, we're in Auckland, we're at a point where it's unsustainable to continue building roading infrastructure to the extent that we have. We've seen it as the solution. We are at a point now, while we recognise the significant benefits of that infrastructure spend, and there are great benefits, these all come with mega, not million, but mega billion price tags. And they come and impose tremendous costs. And those costs include tremendous social costs, because it is the Aucklanders, be they ratepayers or taxpayers, who are bearing those costs. So there are already unbearable social costs that Aucklanders are suffering under. In the coming 5 to 10 years, my view is we're probably going to be at what I would term peak infrastructure. There is nowhere else to go in terms of particularly road building. Efficient PT, we will still be embarking on. But also the revenue sources, they're unsustainable. We know that. We know that the National Land Transport Fund going forward is oversubscribed, and its sources of revenue, road user charges, excise duties, etc., they're under threat by new technologies, e.g. electric vehicles. So we've got challenges there. Environmentally, it's unsustainable, totally environmentally unsustainable to follow this course that we are on, expecting just infrastructure to solve our problems. So we're in a spiral. We need to correct that spiral. We need some step change to break us out of that spiral. And this is the tool, amongst others, but we've known about this tool for some 20 years. This is demand management. We've known for 20 years that the best transport dollar you can spend is a demand management dollar. But we've failed to really make a move on that. So The opportunity costs are enormous. Now imagine what we could do for Aucklanders if we deferred mega billion-dollar spend or cancelled mega billion-dollar spend. We wouldn't have to rate and tax them to the same extent. So there are upsides here. But I think of the government, and I think we've got to convince the government that they've got a massive infrastructure program that could possibly take that spend, like a broken down health system, where our people are struggling to be dealt with in a hospital system because it's not fit for purpose. Imagine if the opportunity cost was one in favour of government spending on its core needs. I'm not suggesting that we should be deferring or cancelling the critical transport infrastructure program for Auckland. The Wairarapa Harbour Crossings project identified a $5 to $20 billion spend to address Wairarapa connections. It's phenomenal. Now, I think in that report it referred to a possible 5-year deferral of that if congestion pricing was in place. So that the upside, I don't shy away from the social impacts, but I think we also need to dwell on tremendous upside here. So it's imperative that we lead this. We need to give confidence to government and its agencies that we're on board for this. Without that, they are not going to be up for it. So today is about sending a signal to government that we're up for it. That is to continue it to the next stage. I'm not suggesting that we're going to land it, but we need to do it with them jointly, and we need to show a bit of strength and a bit of spine in doing that, because it will be an uncomfortable ride in some respects. But we will undertake really deep community engagement, particularly with Māori. We will look at those social impact assessments again, and we will find the solutions to those. We will deliberately find the solutions. So let's do this, and let's do it well. And I've heard a really good, solid engagement here today that I'm sure our staff and all the agencies and government can get a sense that we're on board to progress this. And I'm again come back to David and our team and all the agencies, Auckland Transport. Thank you for your most comprehensive work. Mayor Goff.
Very, very briefly, there are some hungry-looking people around this table, and I concur with your comments, Mr. Chair. Look, we're spending billions on infrastructure, and I was asked by an investigative reporter, will this lower congestion? And the best I could say is that with a growing population, probably it will hold congestion. So we have to do something on demand management. And, the arguments are very clear in terms of huge productivity costs to the city, a couple of $1 billion, very clear in terms of the total frustration. And the Deputy Mayor and I have to travel in probably the longest distances and, wasted hours. We need to deal with the emissions, and we really have to have a situation where we actually accelerate mode change, and we know this will do it. But I want to finish up with this. There are 4 prerequisites, and I'm trying to pick up comments from people like Councillor Casey. First, we have to look after the working low-income people. Secondly, we need to make sure that this is not revenue gathering, and it's not its prime purpose. Its prime purpose is to decongest. So it phase out of regional fuel tax, phase in of congestion tax. Thirdly, we absolutely need to consult with the people of the city. We can't do this actually unless we've got a degree of public support, a mandate to go forward, a social licence. So you guys have done the hard mahi, and you've done it really well. Now it's up to us. And the last point I'll just make, this process began under a national government, and at least the previous spokesperson for the National Party said that he approved of it. It was continued under a Labor government. I've talked to the Minister of Transport and the Prime Minister. They are cautious, but they understand the need for demand management. The Greens favour it because of its environmental impact, and ACT favours it because it's the user pays. So you've actually got a broad spectrum of the political parties. Now we have to have a broad spectrum of the public to get in behind us. But thank you for the work, and I support the recommendations.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. I've got quite a few thoughts on this. I'll try and be as brief as I can. But congestion charging, I do support one part of the report there where it needs to be used for public transport, because briefly we've got 3 huge problems with public transport in this city. There is not enough in existing routes. There is more needed for new routes, such as places like the Northwest and the Waitaku Ranges, and there needs to be funding to do all this stuff, including providing workers with good wages. We need to attack all 3 of those problems to get a good modern system of transport together. And just endorse the comments before, this is a regressive charge. It will affect lower income people and lower income workers more. And it needs good design to try and overcome that regression. I don't know how we're going to do this, but that's how we work on this in future stages. And that includes students as well. Let me just talk about this. I did mention this earlier. Equity issues for 100,000 people from the Northwest. That's what we're talking here. And I am stunned to find that this report was written before we had a solution to the Northwest, and the Northwest itself was not mentioned in the report. That's shocking to me. They live in public transport poverty up there, and something needs to be done to even consider this kind of charge before it's viable for our city. If we were to put this on today, as it was expressed earlier by previous speakers, it would operate as a Massey tax. That's what it would be, a Massey tax, nothing more, nothing less. In Henderson Massey, there are only 32 local jobs for every 100 residents. And in the Waitaku Ranges, it is 17 jobs for 100 residents. We should be incentivising people and actually providing a carrot as well as a stick, not to drive, through local town centre investment, through local jobs that are available before we can penalise those where they have no viable choice. Commute times for West Auckland is out of whack as well. We spend an extra hour per week travelling than the Auckland average to get to work. That's crazy. That's an hour out of your life per week that you could be spending with your family. So despite all of these concerns, I am planning to vote for it today. And I'm planning to vote for it because it says in there that we're going to ask the public, and I want to hear what the public have to say about this. At this stage, I have a fairly dim view on it until we get the necessary situation in place. And one more thing about Stockholm. I've looked this up. Stockholm have 153 train stations, and I didn't find the light rail. That was only the metro. We've got, was it 45, 46, somewhere in there? So I think we need to be honest with the public when we're looking at overseas examples. So I'm planning to vote for it, and let's ask the public, and I'll listen to my instructions from my ward carefully and from Aucklanders carefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson and Councillor Hills.
Thank you. And I sort of have a similar view as Councillor Henderson and others, that I'm sceptical at this time that we are even considering putting this in place without good options for all or many. My community is blessed with access to good public transport, and it's shown in the last 7 years of the census that we have more than doubled public transport users, but that is because we've put good public transport in. There was no congestion charge, and maybe people got sick of congestion, but in the Northcote electorate, the government electorate, we went from 7th ranked in the country for bus use to 3rd ranked in the country for bus use. We more than doubled from 2,200 users of a bus daily, based on the census, to 7 years later, almost 6,000. The Devonport side, the North Shore, very high use of ferries because they've got access to it. So at the moment, 16,500 workers from the North Shore ward come into the city every day, and more than 11,000 of those catch public transport. So phenomenal numbers, but it's not because of anything like this. It's because they have access to good public transport. When I was at uni, a couple of years ago, 12, 13 years ago, there was a bus every 40 minutes at peak, and it was actually more expensive to take the bus back then because it was cash.
it was $4.50, and if you missed the bus, you missed your lecture, you just wouldn't go in, and they were horrible old buses. Now there's a bus every 10 minutes from my house. It's $1 cheaper all this time later, and I know that they're good quality, comfortable buses. It's safe. You have young people, lawyers, people in their high vis. Anyone is catching the bus from my ward because it's easy and affordable and makes sense. But there are places like Councillor Dalton's ward and Councillor Cooper's ward, Councillor Henderson's ward, that there is not the options. And yes, the numbers are lower that come into the city, but as Councillor Cooper says, there'll be more people driven out to outer suburbs of my age and below, especially trying to get on the housing ladder and still working in the city centre. So yes, this is a long way ahead. It makes a lot of sense to try and prioritise, and we've seen that with a bridge disaster that people did once they sort of had no other option or found that public transport was the best option. I had people texting and calling me and saying how shocked they were how good the bus and ferry services were, because they were not driving over the bridge to the city because the bridge was basically gridlocked. So they figured out that the ferry and bus services were far superior than they actually knew it was. So I get the point of a congestion charge, but I remember it when I was in London getting dropped off by my cousin to Kentucky with our bags, but we had to go before 6:30 a.m. because it was about a £10 charge. It was pretty expensive, so it made sense. But they also had the most significant public transport that got started being built 200 years ago. So I guess will be a bit fair to us. We've only started really 15 years ago. But that was why it worked. Everyone knew that, okay, driving to the city centre in London doesn't make sense, but it does make sense to take the train because you have a train station at every single suburb across London. So I'm really sceptical right now that this is fair to put pressure in the back of people's minds when they're already finding it hard to live, work and play in this city. But because we're not confirming the exact mechanisms, and I assume that a removal of the fuel tax, which kind of punishes everyone, not just the people causing congestion, would make sense. So I'll be supporting it going forward, but with the acknowledgement that there's a lot more work to do in the city and that not everyone is blessed like my community who has good public transport options. So supporting the direction. I know it has good processes for climate change and others, but I do worry about our communities that we're kind of just pushing to the side when we keep putting these kind of ideas up. So public transport first for everyone.
Thank you, Councillor Hills. And to close the debate, Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really am encouraged by what I hear today, because I think we are going to have to back our officers and officials on this, because this is one of the really hard debates that we have to have. So I'm heartened by what I hear, and I don't think it's a debate we should shy away from. Financial considerations must be, and we've heard a lot of discussion around the equity issues today, and that is utterly important. But I've heard less, and it's probably only Councillor Henderson that just touched on an issue that's really important to me. When we had COVID, the one thing that people talked about was more family time. The one thing that it touched their hearts, that they could actually be free of the tyranny of congestion and run the bath, bathe the children, do the things that they were denied on a nightly basis. And I think of my own family in this situation. We don't really factor in what the social toll is on the stress, the emotions, the divorces, that everything else comes for those of us who have watched families being destroyed by congestion over the last 20 years. I'm not one of those who passionately believes that this is going to be a cure-all for, there'll be no more roads needing to be built, there'll be no more this or that. This is just one of the ingredients, but it's the ingredient for those of you who are bakers in the room. It's the baking powder. It's the enabler that we can give if we are granted the statutory right to have that tool to be able to deal with things going forward. So I think it will change behaviour. I am utterly convinced, having researched this for nigh on 20 years now, and I think the other thing for me is that the environmental outcomes that will come as a result of this take us again from just the rhetoric into the actual action. So I'm excited by it. I do want to back you as officers of council and board of Auckland Transport, and to know that we can actually go out and have a meaningful debate with Aucklanders on the genuine benefits that will come from this. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I really applaud your willingness to allow us to deal with it fulsomely. It's a really important step in the progress of Auckland.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I think that captures the sentiment and great debate. I acknowledge everybody. We'll go to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. And declare that carried. And I hear that there's no dissenting voices, so unanimous vote. Now, we will leave that item. Thank you, everybody. I have got extraordinary, item 16, there are no extraordinary items.
Just if I may, there is a situation with Dominion Road, which I would like to bring to you. We don't need to debate it at the moment, but it was fast-tracked in terms of a shovel-ready development, and there are some significant issues, and I would hate to think that there is a precedent being established here. So if I may, can I just table my concern with the proposed development for 360 Dominion Road and take it with you offline?
Councillor Cooper, that's a regulatory matter. It's we're talking about 360 Dominion Road, a call-up, fast-track. So that's...
I think it's out of our hands because it's...
rather than drop into the detail now, I'm very conscious.
Yeah. I just don't know what you're asking me.
Fletcher's raised it. I need to redirect that. It's not a planning, but it is a regulatory. Can we have a conversation in the break? I need to...
I also want to use the bathroom, so I'm very happy to keep it brief.
Procedural motion to exclude the public. I'll move accordingly. Can I have a second? Councillor Walker. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. Declare that carried. We are concluding this part. We're adjourning for... Can we make it